Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Can with Mining Journal, and with me I have Ro Darwan, Chief Executive of the International Council on Mining and Metals, who's recently been at the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, where he says the lines were long, the food was bad, but the mining industry played a meaningful role in discussions for probably the first time. Welcome, Ro.
Chris, great to be with you, man.
Providing leadership as the ICMM is important, clearly. Do you feel the mining industry requires tighter regulations to actually get everyone in the industry, rather than just the member companies, onto the same page for the near-term objectives to be achievable?
Look, I think regulation and voluntary leadership have to go hand in hand. They can't be replacements for each other. And let me give you two examples to illustrate the point. The first is on nature and biodiversity, an issue that's becoming more important and will become more important in the years to come. Voluntarily, we as ICMM have committed for the last nearly 2 decades that we will not mine or prospect in World Heritage sites. But that is still permitted by law in many countries around the world. And if we're truly concerned about biodiversity loss, it's necessary to have regulations that prohibit not just mining, but all industrial activity from happening in those places. The second example is on tailings, where voluntarily the ICMM member companies are committed to conforming with the global industry standard on tailings management, which was developed in the last 2 years in the wake of Brumadinho. That will ensure that tailings facilities in operation are managed as safely as possible, but it does not solve the problem of abandoned or orphaned wells. Now, abandoned and orphaned wells or dams will not be solved by just the industry taking voluntary leadership for its own operations. That's where there may need to be regulation. So that's why, Chris, I say that overall, it can't be one or the other, must be both.
Okay, and you've talked about transparency being a driver leading into the global stocktake set for COP 2023. How important is that? How realistic is it? And what are you expecting that to look like from a mining industry perspective? What role should the mining players play?
Look, on greenhouse gas emissions, transparency is absolutely critical. And there's a conceptual reason for that and a practical reason for it. The conceptual reason is we're sitting essentially on a ticking time bomb, which is the world's carbon budget that's been used up and continues to be used up. And without transparency is a bit like trying to defuse the bomb without knowing how much time you have left on the timer. You need it to know how close are we to breaching the limits beyond which we won't be able to prevent the catastrophic impacts of climate change. But the practical reason is, Chris, that for many countries, they do not update their own national emissions inventories at intervals more frequently than 5 years in some cases. So you may not know for 5 years how many greenhouse gases have been produced from a particular country. Now, if that happens to be a large emitter, you may not know for 5 years that we've eaten up a substantial greater portion of the carbon budgets. How do you solve that? You solve that through transparency by individual actors operating in those countries. In our case, actors that are operating with operations around the world. So if we can do disclosure on a regular basis, it fills those gaps, those air pockets between when you get national inventories reporting their emissions data. So what does that look like, Chris, and how realistic is it? Our commitment is that by 2023, where a company isn't already doing so, and many already are, annually, we will report our greenhouse gas emissions for scopes 1, 2, and 3. That information will be externally verified, and all information and data and assumptions that are used to set targets and measure performance will be made publicly available. And finally, that we will report in line with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which really is the benchmark for reporting emissions and being transparent. So is it realistic? Yes, we've committed to doing it. Is it important? Absolutely, it's vital. And these are the steps we're going to take to do it.
Okay, and finally, Ro, just conscious of your time, you've advocated for a fairly long-term carbon price. When you say long-term carbon price, what are you thinking? And you were disappointed that at COP26 that wasn't a feature in some of the outcomes, although I think you've regarded the meeting as generally positive. Is that something that's personal to you, that long-term carbon price, or is that something that the membership's behind as a whole?
The membership has been behind a carbon price for the last 6 years. Personally, I think it's a very good idea too, but for the last 6 years, we have advocated unequivocally that governments ought to set a carbon price. That carbon price should be, as much as possible, predictable over the long term. So it's helpful to have the EU's spot carbon price today. It would also be really helpful to hear where governments think carbon prices need to be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. And the reason that's important, Chris, for me personally and for our members, is that then allows us to make long-term investments in carbon abatement technology, which makes the economics of it so much easier. So we've made the commitment to be net zero. A carbon price will help us in making the investments to get there as soon as possible.
Roe Darwin, thanks very much for your time.